Stripe Radar could be killing your sales. My name is Maria Sparagus, and I am a payment processing expert. I help thousands of 7- and 8-figure merchants figure out common problems with their payment processing. Today, I want to talk to you about how Stripe Radar could be killing your sales. Are your Stripe payments getting randomly declined, or worse yet, have they frozen your funds? Now, you could be doing everything right, and it could be possible that Stripe Radar is just misreading your business and your information. And it's not the first time I've heard this. I hear this oftentimes. I just scaled too quickly, or I was just sending more sales than normal, and all of a sudden I started getting declines, or they're holding my money, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to share with you today is imperative for you if you're using Stripe, and especially, Stripe Radar is qualifying your business as high risk, because you are losing money, and I can guarantee you. And if you listen to the end, I'm going to give you tips and tricks to make sure that Stripe Radar is not qualifying your business as high risk and is not misreading your information. So now, even if you're doing everything right, I can guarantee you there are a couple of things that you're going to learn if you listen right until the end, and you will definitely be getting more sales dollars after you implement these tips. Now, first, let's explain what is Stripe Radar. Stripe Radar uses machine learning in order to detect fraud. And obviously, we're making a lot of leaps and bounds with AI and machine learning and so forth, but you have to keep in mind that their algorithm is still learning, and business is unpredictable, right? I mean, you could have an ad that generates just about nothing, and then the next day you can have an ad that's converting like crazy, and you're making 3 times the amount of sales that you predicted. So Stripe Radar may not be reading your business correctly, and if your business is kind of going up and down on a daily or monthly level, they expect, Stripe Radar likes regularity, likes trends, and so on and so forth. But as we all know, as business owners, even with our best intentions, we cannot predict, how well we're going to do one month versus the other. I have, business owners who are doing 7 figures one month, and then the next month they put up an ad that just bombs or tanks, and then they're doing half those figures. So it's, unfortunately impossible for Stripe Radar to predict what's going on, what kind of ads you're using. And, it will get better over time. But right now, if you're having huge ups and downs in volume, this is probably causing you to get more declines than you should. So, like I said, if you have, huge surges, or, a couple of days that just go off track and you increase your sales tremendously, you could be flagged because they may think you're laundering, or you're frauding people because you just have way too many sales and it's not part of your normal business algorithm, right? So as I said, you have ads, you don't know how they're going to perform. You don't want Stripe, accusing you of fraud or laundering transactions or whatever the case is, just because you have a good ad that converts, right? So that's one issue of how the algorithm can mistake your increase in sales. Another thing is, as traffic is getting more expensive in the US and, the Western countries especially, but particularly in the US, there are a lot of business owners that are looking outside of the US, outside of, their home country to generate sales. So if, for example, you start placing ads in different countries, and you start buying traffic that's less expensive in another country, and you start seeing it convert, and that's not part of your normal business routine or how you sell, Stripe may flag you because they're not used to seeing you sell, for example, in the UK or in some European country or in Asia and so forth. So, a lot of these countries, people have disposable income, ads cost less. So, we're seeing a lot of different business owners who are testing the waters in these various markets. And sure enough, one time out of 2, I'll get somebody who gives me a call and says, for some reason, Stripe froze my account, or, I'm seeing just a whole bunch of declines on my checkout cart. I don't know what's going on. And it's because they've been flagged by Stripe Radar because, it's not part of their regular pattern of business. So Stripe flags them. And there are some obvious ones. If, for example, your customers are using VPNs, or if you have, for example, a younger demographic and they're using prepaid cards, or there's a lot of typos in, the information that your customers are sending you, these are likely getting declined, and they could be good transactions. So it's obviously important to figure out how you can fix these. So the important thing to know is that Stripe Radar actually blocks transactions before they actually even go to get approved. So if your customers are getting flagged for all the reasons that I mentioned just right before, then what happens is that Stripe Radar doesn't even try to process that transaction to see if it's a good card, if the money's there and so forth. They just take a look and say, hey, this falls outside of the patterns, this doesn't work. So we're just going to decline it before we even send it to the customer's bank to get an approval, which is wild, because they're making these decisions for you and your business. It could be a legitimate customer. It could be a legitimate transaction. Most of the time it is, obviously, if you're running a clean business. So, having Stripe do this on Stripe Radar and block your transactions is costing you thousands of dollars in revenue. And if, you take a look at your transactions, which you should be at least on a weekly, if not on a monthly basis on Stripe, you can download your transactions and take a look to see why they're being declined. And you'll see that it's a Stripe Radar decline. So obviously, if you're seeing a lot of these, that means that Stripe is just not understanding your business, or it's not set up correctly to accommodate your business model. So how does Stripe Radar work? Like, what are the mechanisms here? It is basically a scoring system. Now, there are several other companies that offer these types of scoring systems. Like, for example, one popular one is Count. Count. So basically what they do is they have various risk factors. I won't get too into that. There's various things that, these companies look at to qualify whether this is a risky transaction or not. And if typically, the transaction scores below 70, then it's flagged and usually declined. And, obviously they tell the customer that they cannot buy whatever they're looking for. So it is important for you to understand what are the scores that your customers are getting and if they make sense. I mean, there are obviously some legitimate declines. If somebody's trying to buy your product from a country that you don't sell in, or coming from the same IP, you're getting, 20, 30, 40 transactions in an hour. There's some obvious stuff that it needs to block, but there are some other things. Like I said, if, for example, somebody is using a VPN or somebody's using a prepaid card, those are, going to lower the score tremendously. If your business, for whatever reason, needs to accept prepaid cards or is used to people using VPNs in order to buy the product or service, you're likely getting penalized, and a lot of transactions are failing. So a couple of other things is, what they call velocity checks is how many times a credit card is trying to buy from you. So that's a credit card number. So if somebody comes to your checkout page with the same card number, how many times will Stripe allow them to buy? So that's an obvious one, maximum transactions per IP, per card number, per email address. This is to limit, the obvious fraud. But depending on your situation and your business, it may not work. For example, if you have 3 upsells, it may be common for you to have 4 transactions within a couple of minutes. Now, Stripe may say, why would somebody buy, 4 different things at a particular merchant? Well, they don't understand your business, and they're declining based on the fact that, 4 transactions are trying to go through. So it is important to take a look at your Stripe Radar scores. It's also important to understand, what rules they're putting in place. And for example, one of them is maximum number of transactions per card number, and to make sure that it's configured correctly to allow for the number of transactions you may charge, for example, in one 24-hour period or in 1 month, and so on and so forth. Now, another example of this, of why you might get flagged or the score might go down, is for any geographical anomaly. So if, for example, I am traveling to Europe on vacation, my billing address is in the US, and I'm going to buy something, my IP address where I'm buying it from doesn't match the billing address of my card. So that immediately lowers the score. Now, during the summer months, people travel a lot, and you have to decide what risk you want to take. But if, for example, I'm in Canada and I want to send something to my friend in the US, obviously my IP and where something is getting sent to, or my billing address and where it's getting shipped to, is going to differ. So you may want to decide, for example, to allow this or not allow this. A lot of times Stripe does not allow this, and it lowers the score so much that the radar actually just declines the transaction. So what the important thing for you to understand is to understand how people are buying, understand your customer avatar, like what makes sense. Now, some of these things may or may not make sense. Like, why would people be using a VPN to access your site? Or why would they use a prepaid card, and so forth? But other times it does make sense. And, for example, during Christmas time, you may allow customers to have, a billing address and the shipping address, that is very far because people send each other gifts, right? So I may buy something for my friend who lives 500 miles away, and it's a valid purchase because I'm sending it to her house, but I'm buying it with my card. So you have to think of all these different use cases, think of your customer avatar, and make sure that Stripe Radar is updated for your business model. Now, another thing that plays a lot on Stripe Radar and how they approve and decline is, how people are using their computers, their mouse movement, their screen size, how much information is getting filled out at what pace. This can signify whether something's a bot or whether something's, considered fraud. Because, for example, people are copy and pasting information just too quickly onto your form. And that's another, something that would get flagged on Stripe Radar and lower the score considerably. And this is obviously something valid, but it's important for you to know because it may factor in, your declines, and it may also factor into your customer behavior. That's why, I keep stressing knowing your customer avatar and what situations make sense for your customers to buy from you is very important. So you can be able to tell Stripe Radar and configure Stripe Radar to make these modifications. Now you're like, oh my gosh, Maria, my head's gonna explode. I cannot believe that I have lost so many precious sales because I never looked at these settings. And I'll tell you what, even, business owners that I know that are doing over $1 million a month in sales, I see this all the time. They just turn on Stripe and they just let Stripe do what they have to do. Now, when you're working with a provider like my company, Direct PayNet, we will go the extra mile for you. We're going to take a look at these fraud settings and talk you through how you can actually, make sense of these settings and what makes sense for your business. But when you're working with companies like Stripe for payment processing, that burden falls to you to make sure that you're configuring your account for your specific business model. Now, I'm going to walk you through quickly what are a couple of things that you can do in Stripe Radar so you can avoid these common issues that I see so many people suffering from and obviously losing a ton of money because they're not configured properly. Now, first, you're going to go to your Stripe dashboard and you have to know what are the basic rules that are now configured. You're going to go to your Stripe dashboard and you're going to click Radar and Rules. That's where you're going to see what is set up there, like what are, the restraints or the common rules that are in there. And like I said, a lot of them will work for your business, but there may be one or two that are going to be the difference makers for you to make an extra 5-10% in your sales. Now, one thing you can do is you can adjust the score. You can say, I want to be more conservative. I'm worried about risk and fraud. I'm getting too many chargebacks, too many refunds. So I want the score to be 80 or above. You may also lower it. Now, obviously, Stripe's not going to let you turn that off because that's just going to be a free for all, but you may want to lower it to 60, for example, or just keep in mind that it's at 70 and then look at the rest of the rules to see if you can adjust something that would obviously make sense to get your customers to score 70 or above. Now, another thing you can do if, you're worried about risk, you're worried about chargebacks, because, that's one thing that's pretty terrible is, selling something, shipping out a good, incurring costs, and then getting a chargeback. What you can do is for certain types of transaction, Stripe Radar will allow you to flag for review. So you may approve the transaction initially if it scores, let's say, over 70, but if somebody's coming in using a VPN, or if the billing address, for example, is over 100 miles away from the shipping address, you can actually put these rules in where it's flagged for review. You can have somebody in your customer service department. You can take a look at these transactions. They've been approved, meaning they're going through. But if you have somebody daily take a look at these transactions just to kind of do a manual verification to make sure it works. Obviously, I'm going to say something that a lot of people are not going to like, but using the phone to contact these customers to confirm an order. I know it sounds archaic to use the phone, but calling a customer to verify an order will save you a world of heartache if you're selling something that, could be a big financial loss, or to prevent a chargeback or to prevent any miscommunication. So if you have certain things, certain rules, for example, that you want to verify, you can have Stripe Radar put these transactions on the side and you can do a manual review, approve them at first, and then do a manual review. Obviously, if you're doing manual reviews, you got to do it pretty quickly. Usually what I suggest is, at the beginning of your business day, you look at the sales from the day before. So before you ship anything out, before you send any product out, that you have verified this and you see it's a legitimate transaction. Now, if you decide, for example, for whatever reason, the transaction is not legitimate, you can just void it. So what that means is you're not refunding the customer. The transaction likely hasn't gone through, because it takes 24 hours usually, or, let's say between 12 and 24 hours for a transaction to settle. So the transaction shows up on the customer's card. If you decide to void it before then, it's like the transaction never happened and you don't incur any fees for that transaction. So a little, side bonus if you do this, you get to save a little bit money on transaction fees. Now, if you have, regular customers, for example, people who are in recurring subscriptions or who buy a lot of your product and so forth, you can decide to whitelist these customers. Now, you can do this manually, just go in and look at your buyers and see who's buying or who has a regular subscription. And then you can go into Stripe Radar and upload a list daily or weekly of buyers that you trust that are whitelisted, that you don't want them to go through a scoring system because these are good buyers and you trust them. So there is that feature available of whitelisting. Talking about whitelisting and a step further, what you can do is you can whitelist certain countries. So if you're a US business and you're selling outside of the US, you can decide which countries you will whitelist, because either you're buying ads to get buyers from these countries and so forth. And if you just leave it open, Stripe will score different countries at different rates. And obviously, if they're third world countries, you do risk losing more conversions in these markets, because Stripe, may not think that your product matches buying habits in these countries and so forth. But if you whitelist it, then you give yourself a better chance of Stripe approving it, because you're telling Stripe, hey, I'm selling in this country specifically, I'm buying ads or whatever the case is. So they'll see that as a signal that you want customers from that country, and they will score these higher. So as I was saying earlier, and I really emphasize this a lot on my podcast, on my YouTube channel, is you need to know your data. You need to understand, what is happening with your declined transactions, why transactions are being declined. And, if you know this information, then you're able to fix it. If you just see transactions decline and you don't know why, obviously that's going to be a problem. So if you grab your transaction data, put it on an Excel spreadsheet, usually this is available, Stripe, you can put it on CSV or Excel, and then you can sort it and take a look at the declined payment messages. You'll understand why these transactions are being declined and what you can do about them. Now, regarding specifically Stripe Radar, there is a blocked payments tab in Stripe Radar. So what it will show you is transactions that went through Stripe Radar and didn't score the appropriate amount in order to be pushed for approval. So you can then take a look to see if Stripe is judging you harshly, judging your customers harshly, and obviously make some changes to the rules. But you should be doing this, pretty much every day or every week at the least, until you really ensure that Stripe Radar is really understanding your business and is not mistagging or misqualifying your customers and leading you losing money and losing sales and so forth. Now, Stripe is ultimately a tech company. Obviously, they provide payment processing services, but they are a great tech company. So what they have is they have webhooks and email alerts that you can set up that can give you warnings for specific things, like, transactions getting declined because they're coming from a certain country, or if you have more than X amount of declines in a 24-hour period, so you can set up these webhooks or email alerts so you can get some information if something seems to be off or something's going wrong. So think of the scenarios that make sense and set up these alerts, because this can save you a lot of heartache. You don't want to obviously always be logging in and verifying and verifying and verifying. You want to do the initial check that you do now, maybe every 3-6 months, you check it again to make sure that it makes sense. But then you want to set up some alerts. So if there is a problem, you'll get an email, or you're going to get some kind of alert telling you, for example, X amount of transactions have been declined by Radar in the last 24 hours. Something doesn't make sense if obviously that number is too big, and so on and so forth. I can't obviously tell you what that number is, because it'll depend on how many transactions you get, your business model, and so on and so forth. So, take a look at your business model and create these numbers. Ensure you understand your customer avatar, and you'll be able to set up some rules that will really be game changers for you and to prevent unnecessary declines with Stripe Radar and get you more money. So now if you're running over, $25,000 a month or more in sales, Stripe Radar could be killing your sales, could be killing your revenue. One small tweak in Stripe Radar could add, 3, 5, 10% to your bottom line. So don't, waste any time. Get onto Stripe Radar, take a look at what you can do in order to make sure that Stripe understands your business model, understands consumer behavior when buying your specific product. And this may take, a couple of weeks of tweaking. You may not get it right at the first time. I can guarantee you by reviewing these, you will definitely find a few things that don't make sense. Because when you buy a solution, for example, like Stripe, you buy it, you implement it into your store and you start using them, it's made for every single business. Now, every business has its particularities, so you can't expect Stripe to know what works for your customers and what makes sense for your business. So keep this in mind. Take a look at your Stripe radar to ensure that you're maximizing your approval rates and you're not losing precious sales that obviously you're spending a lot of money to get. And now, last thing, if you're working with Stripe, it is always very important to have a backup. So you cannot judge Stripe's performance unless you have another payment processor that you're working with that you can compare the performance. So companies like mine, Direct PayNet, we offer alternative solutions to Stripe. And what we do is we work with you on setting up your Stripe correctly, setting up our account correctly, and we integrate into pretty much every shopping cart, just like Stripe. And then we can pit both solutions together so you can make the better choice for your business. You may decide, for example, if things are equal, to have 50-50 of your volume from one solution to another. And it's important to understand that Stripe is a tech company, and tech companies obviously have downtime, have maintenance time. And it's important to have a backup solution should something happen, or should Stripe, for example, freeze your account or hold your funds. It's always a good idea to have a backup to such an important process like accepting credit cards on your online store. If you have any questions or you'd like to get a no obligation quote on working with us for payment processing, feel free to contact me at the information down below, and I'd be happy to help you. And if you have any questions on Stripe Radar, or you'd like to see, my opinion on what you can add, or if you'd like a little bit more of a walkthrough, feel free to contact me or somebody from my team, and we'd be happy to help you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to leave me some feedback down below. And I love questions, guys, so keep them coming. Thank you so much and have a great day.